All right, hey, we're going to do a quick debrief here on the two constitutional law practice cases for this week. The first one dealt with the First Amendment issue of freedom of speech and a high school that implemented a policy back in 2017. This one's based on a real life incident that occurred, and the letter that you were provided from Principal Whalen is actually real. So this is a real life case scenario. So in this scenario, Principal Whalen Bates of Parkway High School sent this letter home to parents and students, essentially saying that it's going to be expected that all student athletes stand during the national anthem at any sporting event that Parkway High School puts on. So as it's mentioned in the case brief up here, we know that this is 2017, so it's happening around the same time that Colin Kaepernick first kneels during NFL games or prior to NFL games. We know that the reason for that was to protest police brutality in America. A lot of high school students across the country start doing the same thing in response. While that doesn't happen specifically at Parkway High School, Principal Whalen Bates decides he's going to send out this letter and essentially warn students that, hey, if you do this, you are going to be punished. So my question to you in the case was, based on your knowledge of the First Amendment and freedom of speech rights, assess whether or not you think Bates's policy here is unconstitutional. So a couple of things here to think about. We know from our readings and notes this week that state actors, essentially, in order to infringe on someone's freedom of speech rights, they have to have what we call compelling governmental interest or reason to do so, right? So it's a fairly high standard that they have to reach, meaning that they have to have a pretty good excuse or rationale behind restricting someone's freedom of speech. And we'll look at the two major issues here of this case now. So we know that first and foremost, the courts are going to basically weigh these two things, right? They're going to say, on one hand, what's the state actor's interest or reason for having this policy in place? And then does that outweigh the plaintiff's right to express themselves? In this case, I think most objective viewers of it would say, Bates doesn't necessarily provide a compelling governmental reason for instituting this policy, right? Basically, he said he just wants students to respect the flag. That's probably not going to meet this high standard of compelling governmental interest. Now, if he was worried about safety of student athletes or something like that, that might be considered to be a compelling governmental reason, but he doesn't show any cause for that in this letter. The second issue here that the court would likely consider is the speech itself a matter of public or private concern? Now, we know from our readings and the notes that courts are going to go out of their way to protect public speech, not so much private speech, right? And the difference, I think, as I explained in the notes, is public speech has to do with some kind of public policy or public issue, right? Something that's impacting a broad group of citizens. In this case, we know if students were to kneel, they're likely doing so for the same reasons Kaepernick was, which is to protest police brutality in America. That certainly would be considered a matter of public concern, right? Meaning courts are going to be far more likely to protect that than they would if it was just a student's own private speech. I think I used the example in the notes of a student wanting to get their ears pierced or get a tattoo. Those would be matters of private speech, and courts wouldn't necessarily be as likely to protect those. So in this case, again, if we look at these two major issues that the court will consider, I think we could all agree that Bates's policy is likely unconstitutional, right? One, he doesn't really show a compelling governmental reason for having the policy in place that would outweigh the plaintiff's right to express themselves. And then two, the student athlete's speech is a matter of public concern, making it something that courts are going to try to protect. One other thing I want to mention here in regards to this scenario is that we also know, based on the notes, that political protests, so some kind of statement or protest about a political issue at public schools, are protected so long as they meet these specific requirements, right? So as long as they are peaceful in nature, as long as they do not create substantial disruption to the school as a whole, and then as long as they do not violate the rights of other students. So again, we know that Bates's policy here is preventative in nature. He's trying to avoid these instances from happening. But we do know that students at public schools have the right to participate in political protests so long as they meet these requirements. So really only if and when one of these instances were to become violent or disruptive to the school would Bates legally be able to step in and institute this policy. So, I think this case, I rarely give you a real life case, but this one to me is really interesting and topical. I should also note that there really hasn't been any legal action that I know of against Bates or the school for implementing this policy. Some rights groups have come out and said that this is unconstitutional, but as far as I know, no lawsuits have been filed, and Bates has not changed the policy. So, pretty interesting one to keep our eye on. One other question associated with this case, so what if Bates were employed by a private Catholic high school instead, and would this change anything? So if this were a Catholic high school instead of a public school, Bates would likely be able to create a policy like this and not have to fear any kind of legal action. We know from our weeks here on constitutional law that if there's no state action, if you can't prove that the defendant is a state actor, then there's no constitutional law claim, right? So knowing that, private schools have a lot more leeway when it comes to instituting policies like this. And this is the same for professional sports leagues, right? We know that they're able to develop policies limiting player protests because they are not liable for the Constitution like public or state actors are, right? They're a private organization. So if you're a private organization, you get a lot more leeway in instituting policies that might limit speech from your patrons, from your employees, whatever it might be.